This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it's Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. In today's video, we're going to take a look at fog effects. Several months ago, I did a top 10 on damage prevention effects, and while fog effects were eligible for that video, only 2 of them made the list, so I thought it would be interesting to take a deeper look at fog effects in particular. If you are hungry for more damage prevention content, go watch that top 10 after this one. Anyway, fog effects get their name, of course, from Fog, a card from Magic's very first set that prevents all combat damage in a turn. This type of effect can be quite powerful in the right deck, namely in control or combo decks that are seeking to extend the game against more aggressive decks. These decks really benefit from getting another turn or two because they can win the game or pull ahead permanently. Mechanically, fog effects show up the most in green and they appear the second most often in white. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have an effect the same or very similar to the original Fog. In other words, it had to be an effect that stops combat damage from most or all creatures for a single turn. Cards that only prevent damage from a single source weren't eligible for this list, and we already covered some cards like that in the MTG Top 10 on damage prevention. In the end, this means that 46 cards were eligible for this list, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest mark on competitive Magic. This list is actually pretty interesting in terms of the data. It isn't especially stacked. 4 points was enough to make the list, and the number 1 card has fewer than 35 points. However, 22 fog effects, almost half of them, have at least 1 point using my scoring system. And that means that they have a top 8 at a major Magic event. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that in all the MTG top 10s I've done. In short, fogs are pretty likely to see some play, but not very likely to see more than a tiny bit of play at Magic's highest level of competition. This makes some sense, as they are pretty narrow cards that really need the right deck and the right environment to thrive. Speaking of my scoring system, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first-tier top 8 is worth 2 points, and this includes events like Pro Tours and World Championships, and a second-tier top 8 is worth 1 point, and this includes events like Grand Prix and Magic Fests. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, it's Constant Mists. This fog effect comes with buyback, which means you can pay an extra cost when you cast it, and if you do, you just return it to your hand. The buyback cost on Constant Mists doesn't involve any mana, you just have to sacrifice a land. While that is a real cost, it's also one that you can almost always pay, so the card is aptly named as Constant Mists because the person who is casting it can just keep getting it back. Constant Mists gained all of its points at the 1999 World Championship, where it was a sideboard card to bring in against decks using Overrun. It hasn't gained any points since then, so it may be unseated by other fog effects in the near future. At number 9, it's POLLEN LULLABY. This fog effect comes with Clash, which means you and your opponent both reveal the top card of your libraries, and whoever reveals the higher mana value card wins the clash. In this case, if you do win the clash, your opponent's creatures also don't untap during their next untap step, so you can sort of get 2 fogs for the price of 1 out of this, and it even potentially gives you the ability to swing out on your turn since you don't have to worry about a crackback. It is another fog effect that was largely played as a sideboard card, in this case in both Kithkin and green-white aggro decks. It was a pretty nice card in mirror matches. It doesn't have any points since 2009. At number 8, it is Winds of Kalsisma. This fog comes with ferocious upside. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, it turns into a one-sided fog, which is pretty spicy, since it means that your creatures can still do damage to theirs in combat, and if things line up right, you can really decimate your opponent's board with this. Of course, there's also the awkwardness of this card wanting you to have a decent number of creatures in your deck to get the most out of it, and that's a bit awkward for a fog effect. It gained all of its points in standard mono-green ramp decks, where using this could help you survive long enough to cast your spells like Ulamog and Ugin. Buying time to cast these was good because once you got that kind of mana and cast one of these super powerful spells, your opponent basically had no hope of winning, no matter how far ahead they were on the board. Winds of Kalsisma hasn't gained any points since 2015. At number 7, it's Darkness. This is pretty unusual in that it's a black fog, right down to costing 1 mana and having the exact same text box as the original fog. It was printed way back in Legends, well before they had sorted everything out about the mechanical color pie. The fact it is a black fog is pretty good news for black decks that want access to this kind of effect without having to branch into another color. In particular, it's been played in modern ad nauseam decks, which seek to win the game in a single turn by ripping through their whole deck with the eponymous spell, so every turn you can buy with darkness has massive value. It has also been played in Pauper Storm decks, where it plays a similar role. It's likely to keep gaining points in Pauper going forward, although some of the key cards for that deck have been banned, and it's also pretty likely to gain more points in Modern too. At number 6, it is Dawn Charm. Like most charms, this gives you 3 choices, and in this case, one of them is a fog effect. Fogs are quite situational, so it's nice that this card gives you some other options when there aren't situations where the fog part is useful. Of course, the other 2 options are probably even more narrow, since countering a spell that specifically targets you or regenerating a creature isn't always useful. Still, with all these options, it is likely at least one of these ends up being super valuable during mini games. It's used in a variety of decks in Pauper, as a sideboard card in decks like White Weenie, and as a main deck card in Tron decks, which can always use an extra turn to assemble their 3 lands to get a massive mana advantage. It's going to keep gaining points in Pauper. At number 5, it's Root Snare. This card is strictly worse than the original Fog since it costs an additional mana and has the same text box. You wouldn't think a card like that would be this high on the list, especially because the other cards we've talked about so far are all better in a vacuum. Darkness costs half the mana, and the others are all 2 mana fog effects with some additional upside. But context matters, and Root Snare was around in a standard format where fog effects were pretty important. There was a deck called Turbo Fog that sought to draw cards and ramp to the point that it could cast Nexus of Fate over and over again until the game was won, and Root Snare was played as a full 4 of in the main deck of these decks because it helped you pretty much ignore what your opponent was doing as you sought to amass all of your mana and cards. Unsurprisingly, it hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard, since it is largely outshined by pretty much every other Fog. Speaking of Fog, we have the original at number 4. Despite being around since the game began, Fog didn't actually start gaining points until 2013 in Innistrad Standard, where it was played as a sideboard card to bring in against aggressive decks. In Modern, it's been played in the main deck in some versions of Tron and as a sideboard card in Bogles. And in Pauper, it's largely been played in that format's version of Turbo Fog. This deck seeks to draw a bunch of cards while fogging the opponent out, until it can win the game using Stream of Thought to mill the opponent out and shuffle fogs back into the library while you do. It's going to keep gaining points in Pauper going forward. At number 3, it's Tangle. This is a lot like POLLEN Lullaby, except it's better because it always makes it so your opponent's creatures don't untap during their next untap step. It was played as a sideboard card in Standard, where it was particularly potent against decks that were reliant on fading creatures like Blastoderm, because it would not only prevent damage from a big attack, it would also get the Blastoderm a lot closer to fading away. It's also played alongside Fog and Turbo Fog decks in Pauper. At number 2, it's Spikeweaver, the only creature to make the list. Sorry, Spore Frog fans, that card only has 3 points. Anyway, like all spikes, the Weaver enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters and then can do various things by removing those counters. In the case of the Weaver, it can put its counters on other stuff, and importantly for this top 10, he can also remove a counter to fog the whole board. Spikeweaver made its competitive debut at Worlds in 1998, where 4 of the top 8 decks were recurring survival decks, which utilized the 2 powerful enchantments in a toolbox fashion, and they ultimately sought to win the game by reanimating something huge. Spikeweaver was a nice card to search up because it gave you a lot more time to assemble your win thanks to the fog effect. The deck also featured Spike Feeder, and the 2 of them could work pretty well together to fend off aggressive decks early. It was also featured in extended Oath of Druids decks alongside the Feeder, where they played similar roles as utility creatures who bought their controller time to win the game. It hasn't gained any points since 2002, and it probably will get passed by both Fog and Tangle in the near future. And the number 1 Fog of all time is Moment's Peace. This is another 2-mana Fog, but with big upside. It has Flashback, so you can use this 1 card to blank 2 separate attacks from your opponent. It also really benefited from the fact that there was a Madness and Threshold deck in both Block and Standard, and that deck could easily take advantage of Moment's Peace from the graveyard. It was also played in Standard Mirari's Wake decks, which needed several turns to ramp up their mana, and using Moment's Peace a couple of times was a great way to do that. It was used in ramp decks in Extended too, including Heartbeat of Spring and Blue-Green Tron. It's also been played a lot in Pauper, where it's a frequent sideboard card in decks like Tron and Walls combo, and it's of course also played in that format's version of Turbo Fog. It's likely to keep gaining points, further solidifying its place as the game's best fog. So, those are the 10 fog effects that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you're interested in preventing some combat damage, check out the description, where you can find direct Card Kingdom links for each card in this video. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including the one on damage prevention more broadly, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.